In the winter of 1893, in a small town nestled in the hills of rural Pennsylvania, two brothers made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What started as an arrangement born of desperation became a nightmare that no one could have predicted. This is the story of the Pembroke brothers, Thomas and William, and the woman who stood between them, a woman whose presence in their lives would test the boundaries of loyalty, love, and sanity itself. The town of Ashford was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. With a population barely reaching 300 souls, it sat isolated among dense forests and rolling hills, connected to the outside world by a single dirt road that turned to mud every spring. Life moved slowly there, governed by the seasons and the hard work required to survive in such unforgiving terrain. The Pembroke brothers had lived their entire lives in Ashford, working the same land their father and grandfather had worked before them. Thomas was the elder by 3 years, 32 years old in that winter of 1893. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of physical labor, with dark hair that was already beginning to thin at the temples. His face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, with deep lines around his eyes from squinting against the sun. He was known in town as a serious man, responsible and steady, the kind of person others could depend on. When their father had died 5 years earlier, Thomas had naturally assumed the role of head of the household, managing the farm and making the difficult decisions that kept them afloat. William, at 29, was different from his brother in almost every way. Where Thomas was reserved and cautious, William was impulsive and quick to laugh. He was shorter than Thomas, with lighter brown hair and eyes that always seemed to be looking for the next adventure. He had a charm about him that made people warm to him immediately, though some in town whispered that he lacked the seriousness required for the hard life they all led. The truth was that William had always lived in his brother's shadow, following Thomas's lead, helping with the farm, but never quite taking on the full weight of responsibility that Thomas carried so naturally. The Pembroke farm sat on the eastern edge of Ashford, a modest piece of land that had been in the family for 3 generations. The farmhouse itself was a simple 2-story wooden structure, painted white once upon a time, but now faded to a dull grey from years of harsh weather. The barn stood behind it, solid and practical, housing their small collection of livestock. They had 20 acres of workable land, enough to grow wheat and corn, and a small vegetable garden that their mother had tended before her death from pneumonia 3 winters past. Life had been hard for the brothers since losing both parents. The farm demanded constant attention, and without a woman's touch, the house had fallen into a state of functional disorder. Meals were simple and repetitive. Clothes went unmended. The rooms grew dusty and cold. More than the physical discomfort, there was a loneliness that had settled over the property like morning fog. Thomas felt it most acutely. He had always imagined he would marry, raise children, continue the family line. But year after year passed and the right woman never appeared. The few eligible women in Ashford had married young, and Thomas had been too busy keeping the farm running to court anyone from neighboring towns. William felt the isolation differently. He craved companionship, conversation, the warmth of another person in the house. He would ride into town on Saturdays, spending hours at the general store or the small tavern, talking to anyone who would listen. But when he returned home at night, the empty house reminded him of what was missing. The brothers never spoke directly about their loneliness, but it hung between them, unspoken and heavy. Everything changed on a cold February morning when a stranger arrived in Ashford. She came on the weekly supply wagon from Harrisburg, sitting among crates of dry goods and farm equipment, her single trunk beside her. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and she was 26 years old, though her face held a weariness that made her seem older. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had seen better days, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun. When she stepped down from the wagon in front of the general store, several townspeople stopped to stare. Strangers were rare in Ashford, especially women traveling alone. Eleanor had come in response to an advertisement. 3 months earlier, Thomas had done something he never thought he would do. After a particularly difficult week of frozen pipes and a sick cow that nearly died, after eating another silent dinner across from William in their cold kitchen, Thomas had written a letter to a matrimonial agency in Philadelphia. He had been careful with his words, describing the farm honestly, making no false promises about wealth or comfort. He sought a practical woman, he wrote, someone who understood hard work and could manage a household. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had a younger brother who also lived on the property. The response had taken weeks to arrive. The agency sent several potential matches, but only Eleanor had agreed to make the journey. Her letter had been brief and direct. She was a widow, she explained, with no family left after her husband's death in a factory accident 2 years prior. She had been working as a seamstress in Philadelphia, but the pay was poor and the boarding house where she lived was unsafe. She was willing to relocate for the possibility of a better life. She asked for nothing except honesty and fair treatment. Thomas had written back immediately, sending money for her travel expenses. He had told William about the arrangement, expecting resistance or at least surprise. Instead, William had simply nodded, his face unreadable. They had prepared the house as best they could, cleaning the spare bedroom that would become Eleanor's, fixing the broken window in the parlor, even attempting to scrub years of grime from the kitchen floor. Neither brother spoke about what would happen after Eleanor arrived, what the exact nature of the arrangement would be. There was an understanding, vague and unformed, that they would figure it out as they went. Now here she was, standing in the February cold, looking small and vulnerable among the rough men unloading the wagon. Thomas and William had come to town together to meet her, both of them nervous in ways they would never admit. Thomas approached first, removing his hat. He introduced himself and William, his voice formal and stiff. Eleanor looked at them both carefully, her green eyes moving from one brother to the other, assessing. She nodded once, a gesture of acceptance rather than warmth. The ride back to the farm was uncomfortable. Eleanor sat between the brothers on the wagon bench, her trunk secured in the back. Thomas tried to make conversation, pointing out landmarks and explaining the layout of Ashford, but his words felt awkward and rehearsed. William said nothing, stealing glances at Eleanor when he thought she was not looking. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap, her expression giving nothing away. The winter wind cut through their clothes, and by the time they reached the farm, all three were shivering. The first weeks were a period of cautious adjustment. Eleanor moved through the house like a ghost, quiet and efficient, learning the rhythms of the household without disrupting them. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, cook meals that were more varied and flavorful than anything the brothers had eaten in years, and tackle the accumulated neglect of the house. She mended their clothes, organized the pantry, and scrubbed the floors until they gleamed. She spoke little, answering questions with brief, practical responses, never volunteering information about her past or her feelings about this strange new arrangement. Thomas watched her with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. This was what he had wanted, was it not? A capable woman to manage the household, to bring order and comfort to their lives. Yet there was a distance between them that he had not anticipated. Eleanor performed her duties perfectly, but there was no warmth in her interactions with him. When he tried to engage her in conversation during meals, she responded politely but without enthusiasm. At night, she retired to her room immediately after cleaning up from dinner, closing the door firmly behind her. Thomas found himself lying awake, listening to the sounds of the old house settling, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. William's reaction to Eleanor was different. He was drawn to her in a way that surprised him. It was not just her appearance. Though she was undeniably attractive with her clear skin and expressive eyes, it was something else, something harder to define. Perhaps it was the sadness he sensed beneath her composed exterior, or the quiet strength with which she approached every task. He found excuses to be near her, offering to help carry water from the well or chop vegetables for dinner. Eleanor accepted his help without comment, neither encouraging nor discouraging his attention. The arrangement that had seemed so simple in letters became increasingly complicated in reality. Thomas had assumed that he and Eleanor would eventually marry, that this was understood between them. But as the weeks passed and no such discussion occurred, he found himself paralyzed by doubt. What were the rules here? Should he court her formally, propose? Or had she come here expecting something different entirely? The uncertainty ate at him, making him more withdrawn and serious than usual. Meanwhile, the dynamic between the brothers began to shift in subtle ways. William, who had always deferred to Thomas in matters of importance, now found himself questioning his brother's decisions. Why had Thomas not made his intentions clear to Eleanor? Why was he allowing this awkward limbo to continue? William kept these thoughts to himself, but they created a new tension between the brothers, a crack in the foundation of their relationship that had never existed before. Eleanor, for her part, observed everything with those careful green eyes. She had come to Ashford with no illusions about romance or happiness. She had come for survival, for a roof over her head and food in her belly. What she found was more complex than she had anticipated. Two men, both lonely in their own ways, both watching her with different kinds of hunger. Thomas with his sense of duty and ownership, William with his barely concealed longing. She had learned in her short, difficult life that men were dangerous in their needs, that safety lay in maintaining control and distance. So she worked hard, kept her thoughts to herself, and waited to see how this situation would resolve itself. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought a transformation to the farm. The snow melted, revealing brown earth that would soon turn green. The days grew longer and warmer, and there was a sense of renewal in the air. For Thomas and William, it meant the busiest time of year was beginning. Fields needed to be ploughed and planted, fences repaired, animals tended with increased vigilance as new calves and lambs were born. The work was exhausting and all-consuming, leaving little time for the uncomfortable tensions that had been building in the house. Eleanor's role expanded with the season. She planted the vegetable garden, transforming the neglected plot behind the house into organized rows of seeds that would eventually become tomatoes, beans, carrots, and lettuce. She took over the care of the chickens, collecting eggs each morning and protecting the birds from foxes and hawks. She preserved food from the previous year's stores, preparing for the months ahead. Her days were as long and demanding as the brothers', and she fell into bed each night, exhausted but satisfied with her accomplishments. It was during this time that something shifted. Perhaps it was the shared exhaustion, or the way they all worked toward common goals, but the three of them began to function as a unit, rather than three separate individuals occupying the same space. They developed rhythms and routines that worked. Eleanor would have breakfast ready when the brothers came down at dawn. They would eat together, Thomas outlining the day's tasks, William adding his own observations about what needed attention. Eleanor would listen, occasionally offering practical suggestions that both brothers came to value. One evening in late April, after a particularly grueling day of ploughing, they sat together on the front porch. It had become a habit, this end-of-day rest, watching the sun set over the western hills. Thomas had brought out 3 glasses and a bottle of whiskey that had been sitting in the cupboard since their father's death. He poured for all of them, and Eleanor accepted without comment. They drank in silence, feeling the burn of the alcohol and the pleasant ache of tired muscles. William broke the silence. He asked Eleanor about Philadelphia, about her life before Ashford. It was the first time anyone had directly asked about her past. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas thought she might refuse to answer. But then she began to speak, her voice low and measured. She told them about growing up in an orphanage, about marrying young to escape that life, about her husband Robert, who had worked in a textile factory. She described his death, crushed by machinery that should have been replaced years earlier, and the months of poverty and fear that followed. She spoke without emotion, stating facts, but the pain beneath her words was unmistakable. Thomas and William listened without interrupting. When she finished, neither of them knew what to say. It was Thomas who finally spoke, thanking her for sharing her story, acknowledging the courage it took to leave everything familiar and come to this remote place. Eleanor looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since arriving, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and brief, but it changed something fundamental between them. In that moment, they were no longer strangers bound by a practical arrangement. They were 3 people who had found each other in their loneliness, trying to build something new together. Summer arrived with its full force, bringing heat that made the work even harder, but also brought abundance. The crops grew tall and healthy, the vegetable garden flourished under Eleanor's careful attention, and the livestock thrived. The farm was more productive than it had been in years, and Thomas attributed this success to the stability that Eleanor had brought to their lives. But beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, something else was growing, something that would soon threaten to destroy everything they had built. William had fallen in love with Eleanor. He had not meant for it to happen, had tried to fight against it, but the feeling had grown inside him like the crops in their fields, inevitable and unstoppable. He loved the way she moved through the house with quiet confidence, the rare moments when she laughed at something he said, the intelligence in her eyes when she listened to him talk about his dreams and fears. Unlike Thomas, who treated Eleanor with a kind of distant respect, William sought her company whenever possible. He would linger in the kitchen while she cooked, helping her with tasks that did not really need his assistance. He brought her wildflowers from the fields, small gifts that she accepted with a nod, but no comment. Eleanor was not blind to William's feelings. She saw the way he looked at her, the extra effort he made to please her, the pain in his eyes when she failed to return his affection. She felt something for him too, though she was not sure if it was love or simply recognition of his kindness. William was gentler than Thomas, more open with his emotions, easier to talk to, but she had come here as Thomas's intended bride, even if that understanding had never been formalized. To encourage William would be a betrayal, would create complications she could not afford. Thomas, absorbed in the work of running the farm, remained oblivious to what was developing between his brother and Eleanor. He had settled into a comfortable pattern where Eleanor's presence made his life better, but did not demand emotional engagement he was not prepared to give. He appreciated her competence, enjoyed the improved meals and cleaner house, but he had not taken steps to deepen their relationship beyond this practical arrangement. In his mind, there was time for courtship and romance later, after the harvest was complete, after the immediate pressures of farm life eased. He did not realize that his hesitation was creating a vacuum that William was filling. The crisis came on a hot July evening. Thomas had ridden into town for supplies and would not return until the next day. William and Eleanor were alone in the house, something that had happened many times before without incident. They ate dinner together, the windows open to catch any hint of breeze in the stifling heat. William was more talkative than usual, emboldened perhaps by Thomas's absence or by the sense that time was running out, that if he did not speak now he never would. After dinner, as Eleanor cleared the dishes, William stood and moved closer to her. He told her what he had been holding inside for months. He spoke of his feelings, his admiration for her strength, his belief that they understood each other in ways that he and Thomas never had. He said that he knew she had come here for Thomas, but that he believed she could be happy with him instead. His words tumbled out in a rush, desperate and sincere. Eleanor stood frozen at the sink, her hands in the dishwater, staring out the window at the darkening sky. When William finished speaking, the silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Finally, she turned to face him. She told him gently but firmly that what he was suggesting was impossible. She reminded him that she had made an agreement, that Thomas was his brother, that to pursue this path would destroy the family they had built. William listened with his head bowed, accepting her rejection but unable to hide his devastation. What neither of them knew was that Thomas had returned early. His horse had gone lame on the road, forcing him to turn back. He had approached the house quietly, not wanting to disturb them if they had already gone to bed. He had heard everything through the open window. Standing in the darkness outside his own home, Thomas felt something break inside him. Thomas did not confront them that night. Instead, he slept in the barn, his mind churning with anger and betrayal. By morning, he had made a decision. He would not lose Eleanor, and he would not lose his brother. He would find a way to keep them both. Even if it meant embracing an arrangement that violated every social convention he had been raised to respect. When he entered the house at dawn, William and Eleanor looked up from their breakfast with guilty expressions, but Thomas's face revealed nothing. He told them he needed to speak with both of them after the morning chores were complete. The hours until that conversation were tense and uncomfortable. William worked with frantic energy, as if physical exhaustion could somehow absolve him of what he had done. Eleanor moved through her tasks mechanically, her face pale and drawn. When they finally gathered in the parlor, the midday sun streaming through the windows, Thomas began to speak. He told them he had heard everything the previous night. William started to apologize, but Thomas cut him off with a raised hand. He said that he understood William's feelings, that he recognized his own failures in not making his intentions toward Eleanor clear. He acknowledged that Eleanor had been put in an impossible position, expected to be wife to a man who had never properly courted her, never expressed his own feelings. Then he proposed something that left both William and Eleanor staring at him in shocked silence. Thomas suggested that Eleanor become wife to both of them. Not legally, of course, as such an arrangement was impossible under the law, but in practice, in their daily lives, in the eyes of God, if not the state. They would all three commit to each other, to the farm, to building a life together. Eleanor would share her affections between them. They would function as a family unit, raising children together when they came, working the land together, supporting each other through whatever hardships lay ahead. It was unconventional, Thomas admitted, perhaps even sinful by the standards of their church and community. But they lived far enough from town that their private arrangements need not be public knowledge. And was it not better than the alternative, which was the destruction of everything they had built? The proposal hung in the air like smoke. William was the first to speak, his voice uncertain. He asked if Thomas was truly willing to share Eleanor, to accept such an arrangement. Thomas replied that he was, that he had spent the night considering every option, and this was the only solution that preserved what mattered most. Then both men turned to Eleanor, waiting for her response. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. Eleanor took her time before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured, though her words carried an edge that neither brother had heard before. She said that she appreciated Thomas's attempt to find a solution, but that she was not a piece of property to be divided between them. She had agreed to come to Ashford for the possibility of security and partnership, not to be shared like livestock. She told them that if they wanted her to stay, they needed to understand that she was a person with her own needs and desires, not simply a housekeeper and potential mother to their children. Her words struck both brothers silent. They had been so focused on their own feelings, their own needs, that they had not truly considered Eleanor's perspective. Thomas, who prided himself on fairness and rationality, realized with shame that he had proposed the arrangement without ever asking Eleanor what she wanted. William, who believed his love for Eleanor was pure and selfless, saw that he had been thinking primarily of his own happiness rather than hers. Eleanor continued speaking. She said that she had come to care for both of them in different ways over these months. She appreciated Thomas's steadiness and integrity, William's warmth and openness. The farm had become her home, and she did not want to leave it. But if they were going to attempt something as radical as Thomas had proposed, it would have to be on terms that respected her as an equal partner in the arrangement, not merely the object around which it revolved. What followed was the strangest negotiation any of them had ever experienced. Over the next several days, they discussed the practical and emotional implications of the arrangement Thomas had proposed. They talked late into the nights, sometimes arguing, sometimes sitting in uncomfortable silence, slowly working toward an understanding of what this unconventional family might look like. Eleanor established her boundaries clearly. She would not be simply passed between them according to their desires or schedules. She would choose, day by day, how to divide her time and affections. She insisted on maintaining her own space, her own room, where she could retreat when she needed solitude. Most importantly, she demanded that any children born from this arrangement would be raised as belonging to all three of them equally, with no distinction made about biological parentage. Thomas and William agreed to her terms, though not without difficulty. Thomas struggled with the loss of control the arrangement implied, the uncertainty of never knowing from day to day where Eleanor's affections would fall. William worried that Eleanor would favor Thomas, the elder brother, the one she had originally come to marry. Both men had to confront their own jealousy and possessiveness, emotions they had not fully acknowledged until now. They made their own agreements between themselves, promising that their brotherhood would not be sacrificed to competition over Eleanor's love, that they would communicate honestly about their feelings, rather than letting resentment build in silence. The arrangement began tentatively. Eleanor moved between the brothers' rooms, spending some nights with Thomas, others with William, still others alone in her own space. It was awkward at first, loaded with unspoken questions and insecurities. Thomas lay awake on nights when Eleanor was with William, tormented by images he could not banish from his mind. William felt a guilty triumph on the nights Eleanor chose him, followed immediately by shame at his brother's pain. Eleanor navigated between them with as much grace as possible, trying to be fair while also honoring her own fluctuating feelings. But slowly, impossibly, the arrangement began to work. The harvest that fall was the best the farm had ever produced, perhaps because all three of them were working with renewed purpose and commitment. They developed routines and rituals that helped manage the complexity of their situation. Sunday mornings belonged to Thomas, who would take Eleanor for walks around the property, discussing plans for improvements and expansions. Wednesday evenings were William's, spent in conversation by the fire or playing cards at the kitchen table. The other days were flexible, determined by work demands and Eleanor's preferences. To the outside world, they maintained the fiction that Eleanor was Thomas's wife, and William was simply the bachelor brother who lived with them. When they went to town, Eleanor walked beside Thomas while William trailed slightly behind. At church, they sat in the family pew with Eleanor between the brothers, an arrangement that raised no eyebrows since unmarried brothers often lived with their married siblings. The people of Ashford saw what they expected to see, a typical farm family making their way in difficult times. Winter came again, their second winter together. The house that had been so cold and lonely before Eleanor's arrival was now warm and filled with life. There was laughter at mealtimes, music in the evenings when William played his harmonica and Eleanor sang in a clear, strong voice. They were happy, or as close to happy as any of them had ever been. The arrangement that had seemed so impossible and potentially disastrous had somehow transformed into something that worked, something that gave all three of them more than any conventional marriage could have provided. But happiness, as Thomas would later reflect, is a fragile thing, easily shattered. And the secret they were keeping was too large, too volatile, to remain hidden forever. The breaking point came not from within their household, but from an unexpected source, a visitor who would force their carefully constructed world into the harsh light of judgment and consequence. The visitor arrived on a bitter January morning, nearly a year after Eleanor had first come to Ashford. Her name was Martha Calloway, and she was Eleanor's sister-in-law, the widow of Robert's brother. She came without warning, traveling from Philadelphia on the same supply wagon that had brought Eleanor to town. She stood in front of the general store with two children clinging to her skirts, looking lost and desperate. Someone directed her to the Pembroke farm, telling her that a woman named Eleanor Marsh lived there, though she now went by Eleanor Pembroke. When Martha knocked on the door, Eleanor answered and went white as a sheet. The two women stared at each other for a long moment, before Eleanor recovered enough to invite Martha and the children inside. Thomas and William were out checking on the livestock, giving Eleanor time to hear Martha's story. Martha's husband had died 3 months earlier from tuberculosis, leaving her with 2 young children and no means of support. She had been evicted from her lodgings and had nowhere else to turn. She had heard through mutual acquaintances that Eleanor had remarried and was living on a farm in Pennsylvania. She had come seeking help, temporary shelter, until she could figure out what to do next. Eleanor's mind raced as she listened. Martha's presence threatened everything. How would they explain the living arrangements? What if Martha noticed something unusual, asked the wrong questions, realized the truth about the brothers? Eleanor made Martha and the children comfortable in the parlor, gave them food and hot tea, and told Martha she would need to discuss the situation with her husband. The word felt strange in her mouth, since she was not legally married to either Thomas or William, but Martha accepted it without question. When the brothers returned for lunch, Eleanor met them outside and quickly explained the situation. They could see the panic in her eyes, though she tried to maintain her usual composure. Thomas's first instinct was to send Martha away, to protect their secret at all costs. But William, looking at the 2 thin children visible through the window, argued that they could not turn away family in need. It was only temporary, he said. Surely they could maintain the appearance of normalcy for a few weeks until Martha found other arrangements. They agreed to let Martha stay, setting her up in the small storage room off the kitchen that they hastily converted into a bedroom. The presence of another adult in the house, especially one who knew Eleanor's history, changed everything. Eleanor had to sleep exclusively in Thomas's room now, maintaining the fiction of being his wife. William became again what he had been when Eleanor first arrived, the bachelor brother who lived with the married couple. The easy intimacy they had developed was replaced by careful performance. Every word and gesture calculated to avoid revealing the truth. Martha was grateful for their hospitality, too focused on her own troubles to notice the tension in the household. She helped Eleanor with chores, looked after her children, and talked endlessly about her grief and fears for the future. Eleanor listened with what patience she could muster, all while watching her carefully constructed life crumble around her. Thomas grew increasingly distant, frustrated by the loss of the arrangement that had made him happy. William suffered in silence, relegated once again to the margins of Eleanor's life. The situation reached its breaking point 2 weeks after Martha's arrival. One night, unable to sleep in his lonely bed, William made a mistake. He knocked softly on Eleanor's door, forgetting in his misery that Martha was sleeping in the next room. Eleanor opened the door, alarmed, and before she could stop him, William spoke words of longing and frustration that carried through the thin walls. Martha heard everything. The next morning she confronted Eleanor, demanding to know what kind of household she had brought her children into, accusing Eleanor of living in sin and depravity. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.